This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person, one city, or one bad decision. This is about something quieter, more durable, and far more dangerous. What you are looking at is what happens when a system keeps functioning after it has stopped protecting the public, when procedures still run, titles still carry weight, doors still open, but the purpose has already shifted. Nothing collapses. That's the problem. The damage accumulates slowly, legally, respectably, behind paperwork and process, until one ordinary moment, one routine action, suddenly exposes how much harm was allowed to pass through unnoticed. Most people will focus on the visible shock. They always do. But if you stay with me, I'm going to show you why that moment was not an exception. It was a signal, and why what failed here wasn't enforcement or leadership or morality. It was oversight itself. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, stay. Because what comes next explains how this became normal. And once something like this becomes normal, it doesn't stay contained. What actually controls a system like this is not power. It's permission, not written permission, cultural permission, the quiet agreement that some processes don't need to be questioned anymore. Over time, systems stop responding to reality and start responding to themselves. Forms matter more than outcomes. Compliance replaces curiosity. And authority becomes a substitute for verification. That's when the center of gravity shifts. Decisions stop being made based on risk to the public. They're made based on risk to the institution, to reputation, to stability, to comfort. And once that shift happens, accountability doesn't disappear. It gets delayed, redirected, softened, just enough to keep everything moving. From the outside, it looks functional. From the inside, it's hollow. The most dangerous thing about this kind of control is that it doesn't feel like control at all. It feels like routine, like professionalism, like order, until pressure is applied. And when pressure finally comes, it doesn't expose a single failure. It reveals a pattern, one that had to exist long before anyone noticed it. That pattern didn't start with a crisis. It started when no one felt responsible for asking the next question. And that's where this really begins. The most dangerous changes never announce themselves. They arrive quietly, they arrive looking reasonable. Before, systems reacted. They interrupted. They escalated. Now they absorb. What once triggered alarms gets reclassified as manageable. What once demanded intervention becomes a line item. A memo, a future meeting that never quite happens. Nothing feels broken. That's why no one fixes it. Over years, thresholds move. What was unacceptable becomes unlikely. What was unlikely becomes routine. And eventually, routine becomes invisible. People inside the system don't notice the shift because each step feels small. Each adjustment feels temporary. Each compromise feels justified by context. Until you look back and realize the system you're standing in would have shocked the people who built it. This is how slow harm works. It doesn't shock the conscience, it dulls it. By the time consequences become measurable, the cause has already been normalized out of existence. No single decision to point to, no single moment to undo, just a steady drift away from purpose. And when something finally breaks the surface, when reality pushes back hard enough to be seen, it feels sudden, but it isn't. It's overdue. And the next moment is where the illusion starts to crack. Then something happens that refuses to stay procedural, not dramatic at first, just undeniable. A routine operation collides with resistance, movement where there shouldn't be any, force where compliance was assumed. In seconds, the system does what it's trained to do: contain, secure, neutralize. And for a brief moment, it looks like order has been restored. But what follows doesn't fit the original explanation. The scale is wrong, the density is wrong, the materials are wrong. What was treated as a narrow issue suddenly exposes layers beneath it. People who were supposed to be transient turn out to be organized. Spaces assumed to be temporary reveal long-term infrastructure, safeguards that should have slowed everything down. Never engaged. This is the moment where the story could have stopped. A single incident, a justified response, a closed file. Instead, evidence keeps talking. And every new detail quietly contradicts the assumptions that allowed this to operate unnoticed. Not just about who was involved, but about how long it had been allowed to function without interruption. If this were an anomaly, it would collapse under scrutiny. It doesn't. It expands, and that expansion tells us something critical. This was never just hidden, it was accommodated. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. At this point, it becomes tempting to ask who allowed this to happen. That's the wrong question. The more revealing question is how it kept happening without triggering a stop. Because systems like this don't fail through absence. They fail through distribution. Responsibility gets spread so thin that no single person ever feels fully accountable. One office handles intake, another reviews paperwork, another approves delays, another flags concerns that never quite rise to the level of urgency. Everyone does their job. No one owns the outcome. That's the mechanism. Legitimacy becomes a solvent. It dissolves suspicion. Legal titles smooth friction. Procedures slow momentum just enough to keep scrutiny from converging in one place. Meanwhile, risk doesn't disappear. It relocates. It moves outward, into neighborhoods that don't file reports, into communities where harm accumulates quietly and statistics lag behind reality. The system absorbs stability while exporting damage. And here's the critical imbalance. The people who benefit from delay are protected by process. The people who absorb the consequences are not. This is why exposure takes so long. Not because the truth is hidden, but because it's fragmented. Broken into pieces small enough to be individually defensible, until pressure forces those pieces together. And when they finally align, the picture they form is impossible to ignore. But by then, the damage is already mature. And the next phase doesn't arrive slowly. It accelerates. Once the system is exposed, it stops pretending. Movement accelerates, pressure spreads. What was contained fractures outward. Actions trigger reactions faster than anyone planned for. Doors that stayed closed for years start opening all at once. Information that sat dormant begins to connect. And suddenly, resistance appears. Not confusion, resistance. The response is no longer about compliance. It's about survival. Assets move. People scatter. Evidence disappears just ahead of collection. The system doesn't unwind gently, it snaps. What had been buffered by procedure now collides directly with force. The gap between authority and violence collapses. Risk that was outsourced returns upstream, concentrated and volatile. This is where escalation becomes visible, not as chaos, but as pattern. Coordinated, anticipated, prepared for. That's the tell. You don't prepare like this unless you expect exposure. You don't stage defenses unless you know exactly what you've been protected from. And once that expectation is confirmed, there's no rolling it back. Every move forward reveals how deeply the structure had been reinforced. This isn't panic, it's adaptation. And adaptation means the system was never passive. It was ready, which forces the next question, and the one that can't be answered yet. Who was buying the time? Here's where this stops being abstract. Because while the system delayed, while procedures softened impact upstream, the consequences didn't vanish. They landed somewhere. They landed on you, not all at once, not dramatically, in small, cumulative ways that were easy to misattribute. A neighborhood that felt less stable than it used to. An emergency room that stopped feeling surprised. A quiet recalibration of what danger looks like on an ordinary day. You were told these were unrelated problems, isolated, unfortunate, complicated, but they were connected long before anyone admitted it. When oversight fails at the top, harm doesn't stay there. It moves downward, into spaces where there are fewer buffers, fewer lawyers, fewer delays. You absorb the volatility that the system redirected away from itself. And the cruel part is this. By the time the damage becomes personal, the mechanisms that caused it are already entrenched, normalized, defended as necessary to keep things running. If you ever wondered why accountability always seems to arrive late, this is why. If this feels familiar, stay with me. Because what happens next explains why this doesn't stop at one city or one system or one moment of exposure, and why the ripple doesn't ask permission before it spreads. Once a system like this cracks, the effects don't stay contained, because what was protected wasn't small, it was integrated. Roots connect, dependencies surface. What looked like a local failure reveals itself as a node inside something much larger. Decisions made quietly in one place ripple outward through networks that were never designed to be transparent. And those ripples don't respect borders. Jurisdiction doesn't slow them. Distance doesn't dilute them. When one protected corridor collapses, pressure redistributes. Flows reroute. Risk migrates. The same incentives search for the next permissive environment. This is how systemic harm travels. Not as invasion, but as adaptation. And here's the unsettling part. The more interconnected the system, the less visible the danger becomes. Responsibility diffuses across agencies, regions, even countries. Everyone sees a fragment. No one sees the whole, until consequences synchronize. That's when unrelated crises start to rhyme. Patterns emerge across places that don't share leadership, culture, or politics, only exposure to the same underlying mechanics. At that point, containment is no longer a local choice. It becomes a structural test, and uncertainty takes over. Because once you realize this wasn't isolated, the next question isn't where it happened. It's where it will surface next. From here, the system doesn't return to normal. It can't. What comes next depends on which pressure wins. There is one path where adjustment happens, slowly, procedurally. Oversight tightens. Information moves faster than excuses. The system learns just enough to prevent the same exposure from happening the same way again. Damage is reduced, but not erased. Trust stabilizes, but it never fully recovers. There is another path where erosion continues, where reforms look serious but remain selective, where accountability is applied unevenly. The language changes, the structure doesn't. Harm becomes less visible, more distributed, harder to trace. The system survives, but only by lowering expectations of what protection actually means. And then there is rupture. That's the path where delayed accountability meets accumulated consequence, where public tolerance collapses faster than institutions can adapt, where legitimacy itself becomes unstable. Not because enforcement fails, but because belief does. None of these paths announce themselves clearly. They overlap. They compete. They borrow from each other. What matters is this. Every system eventually chooses one, whether consciously or not. And the choice is rarely made at the moment of crisis. It's made in what happens after attention fades, which brings us to the last unresolved question. What happens when the system realizes it's being watched, and when it assumes it won't be forever? There's a comforting myth we tell ourselves at the end of stories like this, that exposure equals resolution, that accountability, once applied, stays applied, that systems remember the lessons we force them to learn. History suggests otherwise. What actually happens is quieter. Attention moves on, urgency decays, oversight slowly becomes selective again, not out of malice, out of fatigue, because vigilance is expensive, because questioning authority is uncomfortable, because normal feels easier than careful, and systems notice. They learn how long scrutiny lasts. They learn what triggers it and what doesn't. They adapt. The danger isn't that this happened. It's that it happened without looking extraordinary until it was already unavoidable. Nothing about this required secrecy, only silence, only routine, only trust left unexamined. So the question isn't whether the next version will appear. It's whether it will look familiar enough to be ignored again. If you want to understand how systems signal failure long before they collapse, stay here. If you want to know what patterns to watch before damage becomes visible, keep going. Because the next story won't announce itself as a warning, and the cost of missing it won't arrive all at once. It never does.